Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to my last presentation of the conference. I'm honored that you're here for the last session of this year's conference. Thank you for coming. I have never done this presentation before, so I'm going to be taking notes throughout, and I'd like you to tell me when I skip something that you know belongs in the life cycle. Um, I guess I should start by introducing myself. My name is Jennifer Hornsby. I work in University Registrar Services. I lead a team of business analysts who are responsible for many of the setup that I'm going to cover here, many of the processes. They help design them and test them, and they help output data about them. A couple of them are here in the room, but I'm not going to call them out, but I hope that they do chime in if I make a mistake because I do that quite often. I have worked in the registrar's office for a while, and I've been in the registrar's office since before we implemented PeopleSoft. So what I'm going to share with you today is kind of a merge between what everybody thinks about a student's life cycle in the real world and then how it shows up in the data, mostly in PeopleSoft, but also in Data Warehouse. Um, let's see. That's the wrong button. Okay. So I divided the life cycle up into some basic high-level categories. First is the setup that we do before a student even applies for admission, when a curriculum is being designed and developed, calendars are being worked out. I'm just going to call it academic structure. It's a lot of stuff that goes into that. Then I'm going to talk about pre-enrollment, which is basically applicant and admit, then the enrollment, and then their academic outcomes and graduation. Um, I had this all designed in my head with a visual diagram that just looks so great in my head, but every time I tried to either draw it or use technology to draw it, it just looked terrible. So for today, I don't have any visuals. I'm really sorry. But I thought we could just walk through the life cycle, talk about when the data shows up and when it starts being updated and when you can use it for things, and hopefully explain why sometimes we have to wait until a certain date that's upcoming before the data that you want is available. So first, academic structure. This is all set up. These are all TBL tables in PeopleSoft, or even if they're not named TBL, they are TBLs. These are tables that we can configure to store our rules and our policies, our dates, all of those things. So the first thing in my mind that happens is a academic unit decides that they want to offer a new program. It goes through the curricular approval process, and I'm skipping over a lot of things. It's approved, and when it's approved, it shows up in PeopleSoft in all of these tables: the academic program plan, the degree table, and the subplan table. Anytime there is a table in Data Warehouse that has combined these tables and made it easier to get to, I've noted it, but I ran out of time, and so there's not going to be as much of that as I wanted there to be here. Next is the term session and academic calendar and all of the dates that control start dates, end dates, deadlines, when a student gets a W when they drop a class versus no W, all of those things. We set all of that up in PeopleSoft. We set up the dates when they can drop without college approval, when they have to go through an approval process, when graduation deadline fees, late fees start, things like that. We also set up the course catalog. These are courses, all the topics, all of the prereqs, which are called requirements in PeopleSoft. ASU has a lot more course requirements coded in the system than most universities do. It's very complex, but it stops students from registering for a course that they're not eligible for. Then the schedule of classes is built. It's built in a year before, it's built a year in advance, and then the academic units have a year to make adjustments. There's a lot that goes on behind that as well, but these are all the tables that are related to the schedule of classes. Okay, so that's all the background. That's all I'm going to spend on that. So the first stage is a learner is an applicant. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about recruitment and admissions because that's not my area. I'm in the registrar's office. But I'm just going to touch briefly on the parts that matter to enrollment. While a student is an applicant, they get a series of checklist items. Some of them are visible in my ASU, some are not. Checklist items are used to tell a student there's a task that they need to do. The ones that display in my ASU show usually as a priority task, not always, but it tells them what they need to do and when and how, and some of them go away automatically when the student does the action. Sometimes they dismiss them to make it go away, and sometimes it just stays on them. And all of this can be tracked. For an applicant, some of the common checklist items are the transcripts that they need to send or test scores, high school transcript, final transcript, all of those things. So all of that information gets put into PeopleSoft along with the detail that tells us if it's a 2-year institution, a 4-year institution, is it a foreign institution? Also, whether they have a high school diploma that goes into the external degree table, any other external degrees, bachelor's, associates, masters, all of those degrees all get loaded into these external education tables. They all start with PSEXT. The degree table is interesting. It stores information about all the degrees, whether ASU degrees or external, and there's a flag that tells you if it's internal or not. So there's degrees in that table that ASU doesn't offer, but there's a flag that tells you whether it can be used for an ASU program. Next is student groups. So student groups are fun. Student groups are used when you need to identify a population to track them. Maybe it's for tuition and fees. Maybe it's for prerequisites for a specific class. Maybe it's for some other reason larger than that. But student groups are used when you can't identify that population any other way with any of the attributes that are available. The example I like to say is, let's say you need to reserve seats in a class for students that like Honey Nut Cheerios. Well, that's not stored anywhere. We don't ask that on the admission application. We don't know who those people are, but if somebody needs to do that and they have a way of finding out who likes Honey Nut Cheerios, and they want to tag students with that student group, they can do that, and then they can reserve seats for those students in their class. That's a bad example, but just so you know, that's about how I think about if there's any other way that the students can be identified, if there's any combination of program plan, admit term, they took a class at one point that no one else took, we recommend that they do that rather than using a student group. There are some processes that won't go to that level of complexity though, and even though you could identify the group, say with a report or a query, the actual engine that's going to do what it needs to do won't use it. So the tuition and fee calculation engine is an example of that. There are some times when it has to be in a student group for that to work. So here's all the student group tables. Student group history is the main one that tells you if they're active or not in the student group. We have all these really nice, easy to use data warehouse tables that make it really easy to get to those without drilling through all the effective dates. And then the setup table is at the bottom, and the description and short description of that can give you some insight into what the student group is for. Okay, now let's say the student got admitted and they're active. What does being active even mean? For the registrar's office, being active means they're their academic record is active on the program plan stack. The program plan stack comes to us originally from the admission application, and the admissions office runs a matriculation job that throws the records over into the academic side of the house. And not just at ASU, but all the PeopleSoft schools in the country, in the world, call it throwing it over the wall. And there's a reason, because once admissions matriculates the student and it comes over to the academic side, admissions can no longer update that exact record. There are steps where we can make it so we can throw it back over the wall to them if they need to do something. That's pretty rare. But then after they update it, they throw it back over the wall to us. So there's just the concept of there is a wall in between the two processes. They send all the data to the academic side and then they can't update it anymore. Okay, so we create the program plan stack that includes the subplans, if there are any. And once that record exists, we call the student active as long as they haven't been inactivated yet. So while before they exist in the program plan stack, they're not an active student. Once they exist in the program plan stack, the status of the record tells you if they're active or not. Once they exist there, their major can be changed. We can add minor certificates, concurrent degrees, all of those things can be added to those stacks. These are all of the tables, the ACAD Prog, ACAD Plan. Not everyone has a subplan, but they can. And all of that data is also stored in the student profile major current. It's also in this data warehouse table at the bottom. You can see I put the English names on the tables that I know really well, and I don't know the other ones really well. So I have to come back and add that later once I learn them. This is also when we tell a student who their advisor is. We assign an advising committee. Some colleges, it literally is a group of advisors that they can choose to meet with. In other colleges, it might be one person in their committee. But this information is what gets displayed in my ASU, so they know who their advisor is, how to contact them, and how to schedule an appointment. Then after a certain point in time, we term activate. So to the registrar's office, describing a student as active versus term activated means something completely different. And I'll tell you why. Term activation starts on the 22nd day of the prior fall and spring term. We don't run term activation for the upcoming term until we've already discontinued student non-enrollment. I'll get into non-enrollment at the end because ideally we don't ever want that to happen. We want them to persist. We don't want them to ever fall out of the attendance cycle. When we term activate the student's record on the program plan stack, their admit term has to be an admit term that is the term we're activating or a prior term, and that student's status on their program plan stack has to be active as of the term start date of the term we're activating for. That means if they've already graduated, we don't term activate them. If they've been discontinued, maybe they withdrew their admission application, we don't term activate them. We also don't term activate them if they have applied to graduate for a term prior to the term we're activating. Once we start the initial term activation, we run it every day. That's just the first time that it starts. What that means is until we've term activated for the upcoming term, students don't exist in the student car term table. That means we don't know their academic level. We don't know how many transfer credit hours they have. We can't post test credits. We can't do any of that until we've term activated. So we term activated for spring on September 12th, which is the day after the 21st day of the fall. We won't be term activating for next fall until the end of January, early February, about that time. Once we term activate, records appear in these tables. PS student car term is the student career term table, and it holds all of the term statistics for a student who is term activated. That is their credit hours, their GPA, their academic level. Everything that aggregates over time is in that table as well. Once they're term activated, they show up in the student profile major by term table. They get their enrollment limits and their session enrollment limits. Why do we term activate? A term activation causes the term to be available to the student in order to start adding classes to their shopping cart. There's a lot of other things that go on behind the scenes for that to actually happen. But if they're not term activated, they can't do any of that. Also, a prerequisite to term activation is having their residency status determined, either resident or non-resident. We can't term activate until that's happened. That's a great question. We have to term activate everyone for every term. I'll get into it at the end, but we enforce the continuous enrollment policies by discontinuing students who don't meet that policy, which means they can't register for upcoming terms. Exactly. There's, I'll try to cover what some of the policies are when we get there, but they cannot register for classes in a term unless they're term activated for that term. And in order to enforce the continuous enrollment policies, we have to run discontinuation first and then we term activate, which is why we don't term activate until the previous semester. See, in my head, it's a circle. In my head, it makes perfect sense. I just don't know how to draw it. Okay. As soon as we term activate, they finally get their test and transfer credit posted. This is when they know exactly how many credit hours were articulated, either as equivalent or not equivalent as an elective credit or not. They get their totals. That's when we know if they're going to come in as a sophomore, a junior, or whatever they might be. We don't know that until this happens. The transfer credit articulation gets tied to an articulation term, and course equivalencies can change over time. And so that's another one of the reasons why it doesn't happen until they're term activated. We know the articulation term and can tie it to that term. Milestones, I'm not going to talk a lot about, but this is also when we process and post milestones. For incoming undergraduates, most of them get a English and a math placement milestone, and those are used for enrollment requirements that controls which composition courses and which math classes they can register for. Some academic programs use them for a lot of other things that I'm not going to talk about today. They're all stored in that table. Next is mandatory advising, which may not be mandatory. The mandatory advising system is used for academic units to organize which students they need to advise and for what reason. And that allows them to control which office that student is referred to for whatever the issue is. There's a concept of a priority of how severe the reason is that they need to see an advisor. So they might need to see someone in the dean's office rather than someone in the department of their major. So all of that is managed with the mandatory advising system. If the student is required to be advised, they get a service indicator that blocks enrollment and it displays in my ASU and it tells them that advising is required. If they're not required to be advised, then as soon as we start term activation and this process starts for the upcoming term, even if they don't need to see an advisor, they make an appointment with their advisor, the advisor can add all the advising notes in the same set of tables. Because sometimes those notes can be thousands of characters long, the actual notes are not in Data Warehouse, but you can see them in the Salesforce student profile. Some students get a bunch of other service indicators. One of the common is the MMR requirement. So most students that are new will get a service indicator for that. But there's all sorts of service indicators that can be added and removed. We can control whether it displays in my ASU or not. And then there's the concept of a positive and a negative. And positive and negative doesn't mean what you think it does. Positive just means it's internal only and will never display to the student. One of the examples of those is the military affiliation is a positive service indicator that we use to know that this student receives services or can receive services. It's never going to hold anything. It's not a negative. So these are all the tables that tell you if the student has a service indicator, what it is, what it's for, what is the message displayed to the student. I forgot to list the name of the custom table that stores the HTML that isn't in the delivered table, but there is one. There's the service impact table that can be attached to a service indicator. If it doesn't have an impact, it's what we call information only. We can still display it in my ASU, but no impact means it's not going to hold a diploma. It's not going to hold enrollment. It's just information only task that they need to do. Am I going too fast? Have I skipped stuff that you thought should have already been in here? Okay. Let's see. Next, the student might want overrides or permissions. Because we have all of those enrollment requirements on courses, sometimes the student wants an exception for all sorts of reasons. Different people in the academic units can give overrides for enrollment requirements, for section full, and for time conflict. They can do it at the course level, which means any class is overrode, or they can do it at the class level and then just that specific class is the student can get into. Those can expire as well. We also, I don't know how to say this. Students have maximum credit hours that they can register per term and per session. And that's all controlled with the setup at the beginning that I said. There's a whole bunch of setup that we do. Well, once the student is term activated, then someone can override it. They can override the maximum. They can also override the minimum and not let the student drop below a certain number. And so none of that can happen though until we term activate. So once we term activate, you start to see that coming through. This table at the bottom is where the session limit overrides are stored, but it's not in data warehouse. Next is registration dates, also known as enrollment appointments. In the fall and spring, the way we manage having 180,000 possible students that could register for classes, we don't want them all trying at the same time on the same day. So we space it out as best we can. A lot of analysis goes into how many students used this chunk of time last semester. Can we put more in it? Can we put less? How many days do we need? This isn't just to space out the load on the ASU systems. It's also to try to spread out the workload on the academic advising and enrollment staff so they don't have everybody coming in saying, I need to be advised, my appointment starts tomorrow. So we try to spread it out as best as possible. These are called enrollment appointments in the system, but publicly we usually call them enrollment dates. I'm sorry, registration dates. We don't want anyone to think that once the appointments came that it's over and now they can't register. So think of it more like it's the date that student can register for the first time. We only do that for fall and spring. And then after, it's more like what is the open enrollment date, and all of the appointments are before that. But for fall and spring and for summer, there's an open enrollment date where you can register without an appointment. There was something else I was going to say right here and I forgot. Yes. Great question. There is. There is logic. In general, students with the most credit hours get an appointment first. We're thinking they have fewer classes that they can choose from that they need to take to graduate. So they get the first dibs at the seats in those classes so that they can graduate. We do it by academic level, but also by credit hours within that academic level. Same thing for graduate students. Law, I think, is just degrees, what is it? Third year law first. Okay. So yes, there is a lot of thought that goes into the way that they're given their appointments. And there are groups that have priority appointments. So yeah. Also, online students, their appointment is first. They're usually not competing for seats in the same classes as everyone else. There was something I was going to say about registration dates and I can't remember. So if I remember, I'll make a note. Of course. Good question. The question is there a set time? Currently, all of the appointments start at the same time every morning at 6 a.m. When a student is particularly anxious about whether they're going to get a seat or not, we can recommend that they add it to their shopping cart in advance the night before. Then all they have to do at 6 a.m. is log in and hit the submit button, and hopefully they get their seat. Right now, class search is real time. It tells them how many seats are left right now. So, yeah, 6 a.m. Thank you. I'll repeat that in case for the recording. So the question was, when do the appointments start showing to the student in my ASU? And the answer was about 2 weeks before the appointment begins. Up until that point, they also have a checklist item as a priority task that says, get ready to register, gives them some information that they need to do. We changed that to a different message that says it's time to register after their appointment. Okay, enrollment. An enrolled student. This is the most difficult question to answer for me because there's so many it depends. But at a high level, an enrolled student means that they have enrollment in the student enroll table. The student enroll table only holds successful enrollments. So if a student tried to register and they weren't eligible for anything, or they got time conflicts for everything, they never appear in that table. They have to be successful, added into at least one class. Once they're added to the class, if they swap, drop, edit, all of those things, that the latest state of that record is stored in the student enroll table. The granularity is the student's EMPL ID, the academic career, and the S term and a class number. If a student adds a class, drops a class, adds the same class, drops it again, adds the same class a third time, and believe me, students do this, you'll only see the latest record about all of those transactions in the student enroll table. This table is one of the most important records to the registrar's office. This is the final grade. This is the final current registration status. These records are complete back to 1980. And for some students, we've gone ahead and populated their record in PeopleSoft before that. But just know anything you see before 1980 is not complete. So if a student exists in this table, generally we consider them enrolled. There are some exceptions. We don't usually consider global launch enrollment as an enrolled ASU student. Um, Sometimes we only want students that stayed enrolled and didn't withdraw. So they stayed enrolled in at least one class. Sometimes we say enrolled student means they got a grade, they have a transcript. So when I say it depends, it really depends on what the use case is, what we consider to be an enrolled student. But definitely, if they don't exist in this table and they don't have a service indicator that they're from before 1980, then they are not enrolled. The table underneath it holds the enrollment request detail of all the transaction attempts the student made. So every time they tried to add a class and got an error message that the section is full, it's all in that table. There's a lot of other tables that come off of it, like message logs that tell you what the error was, what the class, what the exact message was the student received. And I didn't put the shopping cart here, but it's in a later slide. So that's enrollment. It's pretty clear, right? Um, Once the semester begins and the student has participated in the class, and I'm not going to talk about the difference there, that's a very gray area depending on what it's for. But once the student has been in the class and participated and they're learning, then we, at least for most undergraduates, we have academic status reports. These are like early warning, or if you come from another university, maybe a midterm grade is more familiar. But these are early warnings to let the student know that they have an issue in a class. They can be positive. They can get messages that they're doing great. But this lets a student know early enough to take corrective action that they need to start coming to class more. They need to get tutoring. They need to do something in order to be successful. Then is the 21st day census. This happens on the 21st day of the fall and spring term. Right here, I'm talking about the 21st day of session C. We also do a 45th day and we do a 21st day of session B later in the term. But the census, where everything else that a lot of people care about is this, and these are the census tables that happen. If the student withdraws before this date, then they're not captured in the census. They also probably would have got a 100% refund. I'm going to make a note about that. Refund deadline should be in this. Refund. So that's the 21st day census. And sometimes students withdraw. We have a custom request form right now that stores the requests and the approval status. It also tells you the reason why the student indicated they were withdrawing. This is a fairly new process, maybe 2 or 3 years back. So I don't think we've learned all we have to learn from that yet. Student completes the class and then they get a grade. Some people call this a transcripted student. It means they have a transcript from your institution. They have at least one grade on the transcript, even if it's just a W. Hopefully they have more than that. But as soon as they have a grade, they can have an ASU transcript. Once they're graded, a lot of other things happen. The tables that store the grade are the student enrollment table, which also includes the repeat codes that tell you if they've previously taken the class, if it's being excluded from their GPA. The grades also impact their GPA and PS student car term and in student profile major by term. As soon as grades are posted, we disenroll students who don't meet the prerequisites anymore. So we do this at the end of session A and the end of session B and C, depending on the date and which one is last. So if a student is eligible to enroll for a course because they're currently in the prerequisite, but they fail the prerequisite or they don't get a high enough grade to meet the prerequisite anymore. We have a process that will identify them. The colleges have a period of time to review who's going to be dropped, and then we drop the students before the next session starts. So there's not a lot of time. There's about 2 days in between that to let the colleges review it, notify the students a warning that they're probably going to be dropped, contact their advisor, and then we drop them and then they get another notification. If a student gets an incomplete in a course, they have a year to complete it. If they're an undergraduate, then after a year, the grade is lapsed to a failing grade that impacts their GPA. If they're a graduate student, it's just set to a permanent incomplete after that point, and that information is in the student incomplete table. We also do a process called repeated. Well, we call it repeat, but it's about repeated courses when the student repeats the same course for a better grade, hopefully. We do this at the end of the fall and spring and summer, and we do it fairly manually at the end of session A each semester when we need to for students that are graduating. But when a student repeats a course for a higher grade, there are policies that say an undergraduate can only repeat up to 12 credit hours for grade improvement. And after that, both grades are averaged into their GPA. So we have dozens of codes. Maybe it's only 12 codes. Seems like dozens that control whether the grade counts in their GPA and whether the credit hours count in their total credit hours. And then for all the students that did really well, we have Dean's List. So this is the table for Dean's List. This shows on the unofficial transcript. Many colleges also have custom processes that produce certificates they can get through my ASU. Sometimes colleges send them t-shirts, you know, all sorts of fun things to congratulate them for doing so well. We also have academic standing. This is for undergraduates only. And this is the academic warning, academic probation, academic disqualification. Once a student is disqualified, they can't register in a fall or spring semester. They could register for summer if they want to try to improve their GPA or repeat a class. But the academic standing is just done once at the end of each fall and spring semester. It's based on whatever grades are submitted at that moment. If grades are late, there's no magic process that updates it. When we run academic standing, the academic units have about a week, sometimes less, especially in the fall, to review the students that are disqualified before we disenroll them for the upcoming term. These are all the tables that hold the information relevant to who we're going to disenroll for disqualification. So the academic standing table, the service indicator data table tells us who is disqualified easily. And then there's another process there that we disenroll, and they cannot register for upcoming terms either until they have met the requirements of their academic college and they're taken off of disqualification, either put back on academic probation or on good standing in some cases. So we have to go back to the term that they were disqualified to make that change. So if you look back now at a student in a prior term who was disqualified, you should only see that their current record for that old term is either good standing or probation. There's history stored of that they were disqualified, but it's you have to drill in to see it. There's also groups of students that we have to add transcript text to their record. Maybe they did a study abroad program, maybe they're a Barrett Honors student, maybe they're studying in another country, and we have to indicate that the method of instruction was, sorry, the language of instruction was Chinese or Szechuan, not English. So we add those texts to their record. At the end of the semester, we do a shopping cart purge. So these are all the classes the student put in their cart and didn't submit. It gets too big, so we purge it now. But there is a table, you can see what's in their shopping cart. Once a student has a grade, they can get an official ASU transcript. They can also get an unofficial ASU transcript. But all of these are tables that record where they requested the transcript to be sent. There's also a purpose field, so they'll tell you, if they choose to tell you, whether it's for employment or a scholarship or a study abroad, or if they're planning on transferring. Then they can apply for graduation. They're not supposed to apply until their last semester, when they are registered for the classes they need, the last classes that they need. When they apply for graduation, you'll see it in the academic program plan stack. But we have the ASU graduation application tables that store extra information. Like, are they planning on transferring credits before they graduate? How many hours is that? Things like that. So that's all there. Then they graduate. Now they're a graduated student or a graduate. When they graduate, the records end up in these tables, the ACA-DEGR tables. There's a record for the degree, the plan, the subplan, and then if they have any degree honors. The records show up here as well if it's an approved certificate. I don't know how to describe what an approved certificate is. I'm not going to. Some departments offer their own certificates that are not ASU curricular approved. So the ones that are get in here. Last, I said I would talk about discontinuation. So we discontinue students who don't meet the, oh, that's a typo. I'm going to stop the urge to fix that right here. When they're not enrolled, in order to enforce the undergraduate quick reentry policy, the graduate continuous enrollment policy, and the law continuous enrollment policy. For undergraduates, we used to require they register every fall and spring, or they would be inactivated. Currently, it's 7 semesters, so they get 3.5 years to stay out without having to apply for readmission. If they don't register in their 7th semester, we discontinue them. We future date it to the end of the term so that if they register for session B, they can. We want them to come back. And so if they register, then we delete that future discontinuation role. And that's what lets us term activate them for the next term. Same for graduate. They don't get 7 terms generally, but they do also have continuous enrollment requirements. Degree seeking, I think, is every fall and spring term. There's different rules for new admits than continuing students. There's different rules for F1J1 than not. And there's also different rules based on whether they're online or not. So there's a whole bunch, 10, 12, 15 different sets of rules. But we run discontinuation on the 22nd day of every fall and spring term. We only run it once. If the student doesn't need to be discontinued at that moment on that day, we don't discontinue them. There's some large populations, we come back the next term and we clean it up. But usually academic record changes, administrative changes after the fact cause some students to fall through. They're still active even though they shouldn't be. So once we discontinue all of those students, which we do on the 22nd day, then we run term activation for the upcoming term. And we have to do it in that order so that we only are allowing the students to register for the upcoming term who meet the continuous enrollment requirements. And then if we discontinue them, they have to apply for admission again before they can register. So with all of that said, that is the reason why to the registrar's office, there's a big difference between an active student, a term activated student, and an enrolled student. And there's a lot of gray in between there, but to us, it means something different. When we discontinue the program plan stack, it's just updating the same program plan tables that we started with at the very beginning. So in my mind, you see that's the circle we came back to. That's also where the fact that they're graduated and completed shows. All right. So what do you think I left out? Yes. Good question. So the question is, what does it look like when a student's program is discontinued? Usually we don't discontinue programs that students are enrolled in or term activated in without having a plan to let them complete that program in a very similar major but different. We have some reports that the courses team in the registrar's office runs regularly on plans that haven't had enrollment in X number of terms, just for an example. There's pre-built reports that academic units can run to list the students that are term activated to get a number by plan code. And sometimes the provost office just asks for a custom, how many are in this program right now? But in general, we wouldn't discontinue the program while students are term activated. To me, that means even if they're not registered, they could register. So that's the 7-term quick reentry for undergraduates I described. We do reorgs all the time. It used to be every summer, but now it's like every fall, spring, and summer. But sometimes a program might be merged or moved or renamed. And then sometimes we have to move the students as well. So I thought about throwing in study abroad and all the other things that happen in between, but I don't know enough about them to know where they go. I had enough of a hard time putting these things in a chronological order in my mind that makes sense. And half of these things I could have put in a different order and it still would have made sense. But so I left out some things that I'm just not an expert about. But this is pretty much about the academic record as I know it. So I'm going to work on my picture later. Any other questions? Okay. The petition to repeat the class for the third time, I don't know that we see the petition itself anywhere. When it's approved, though, you see it in the student enroll table, the repeat code. There's a code that indicates they have permission to take it the third time. They can't register the third time without that code being on them. So I think we put it on the second time. Yeah. Yes, of course. Thank you. It's a starting point. If there's any artists in here, maybe, or um, anyone that's really good at visualizing things. Okay, thanks. That'd be fun. All right. Well, if you have questions about this or anything that me or my team can help with, you can post I won't say quick questions. I'm going to say questions that have quick answers in Slack, and we'll be happy to answer them there. You can also contact me and my team at urtech@asu.edu, or you can contact me directly. And if you have a second, please fill out this really quick survey. Tell me how I did. Thank you very much for coming today.